As you can imagine, this was not well received in the other colonies. When, for example, New Amsterdam refused entry to a shipload of Quakers in 1657, the Dutch Reformed clergy were asked where the Quakers went. "We suppose they sailed to Rhode Island," they replied, "for that is the receptacle of all sorts of riffraff people, and is nothing less than the sewer of New England. All of the crowds of New England retire thither. They are not tolerated in any other place." Well, the scorn of the Dutch clergy for the Quakers could well describe what a growing number of people, at home and abroad, believe about the United States today. Free expression in this view has created a sewer of offensive, blasphemous, and destructive speech that is harmful to religion. The lively experiment this argument goes is now far too lively for our own good. And polls suggest that Americans are increasingly intolerant of offensive speech, especially when it concerns religion. According to a survey that First Amendment Center conducted a couple of years ago, an astonishing 43% of Americans do not think people should be allowed to say things in public that might offend religious groups. Not that even would offend, that might offend. That's 43%. Now, I don't know if that shocks you, it does me. The concern about offensive speech comes from both ends of the political and religious spectrum. On the right, many religious traditionalists, such as Bill Donahue of the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights, are fed up and deeply offended by the treatment of their religious faith in the culture. Think South Park. And in the media, think Oliphant's cartoons about the sex abuse scandal. Now, these concerns have led to calls for more regulation of the media, especially cable television. Although popular culture is viewed as the chief offender, leading newspapers and network news programs are also viewed by many as hostile to religious people. And that may partly explain why our poll also finds that 40% of the American people believe that the press in this country has too much freedom. Meanwhile, on the left, a growing number of people, especially in the academy, argue for limits on offensive speech. Offensive speech about race, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and more. According to the Foundation for Individual Rights and Religion and Education, more than 73% of public universities maintain unconstitutional speech codes, despite numerous federal court decisions striking down similar policies. Overall, 68% of colleges and universities surveyed have policies that restrict freedom of speech. What people on both sides of the spectrum, both ends, would do well to keep in mind, I think, is this. Yes, of course, free speech can offend. Here I only need mention the Reverend Fred Phelps. But protection for religious freedom is ultimately tied to a strong guarantee of freedom of speech and press. Just as censorship in the history of the Western world is rooted in efforts to sustain state establishment of religion, so freedom of expression in America was born of a determination to end state enforcement of religious conformity. As tempting as it might be these days to use the engine of government to protect religion from offense, religious groups must keep in mind that state power that may protect them today could be used against them tomorrow. What is blasphemous to one is a religious conviction to another. The danger lies in giving government the power to decide who is right. You know, in my view, the only thing worse than an uncivil society is a society where government determines what is civil. As Roger Williams understood very well, full religious freedom requires the right to offend. Without it, no religious group, except perhaps for those in the vast majority at any given time or place, is safe from censorship or persecution. Now, that doesn't mean that we should sit back and do nothing to address the concerns about speech that are speech that's deeply offensive to people of faith. But if speech codes or other government regulations are not the answer, what is? What must we do to sustain and even expand this lively experiment in freedom while simultaneously taking seriously our civic responsibility to encourage a civil and respectful public square? Well, that's a big question, but I'm going to limit myself to one modest suggestion born out of my lifelong involvement with public education. I would say that education, finally, not censorship, is the key to creating societies with high levels of mutual respect and understanding. Now, at present, most Americans and Europeans, I would say, know very little or nothing about the religions and beliefs of others, their neighbors, people living in their own country. And sometimes they know precious little about their own. In a world where religion is at the heart of our most difficult challenges, this illiteracy can be dangerous. In 2007, the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, issued what I think is a compelling wake-up call to citizens of all 56 member states, including the United States, about the dangers of ignoring religion in our schools. It's entitled The Toledo Guiding Principles on Teaching About Religions and Beliefs in Public Schools. It's named after the Spanish city where we had the initial drafting. And the report urges nations to take religion seriously in education and provides a human rights framework for including fair, accurate study about religions and beliefs in the classroom. When Western Europe, with some of the most secular societies on earth, supports guidelines for putting more study about religion in state schools, I would call that a truly Nixon goes to China moment. But many Europeans, like many Americans, are finally beginning to understand that ignorance about religions and beliefs in religiously diverse societies is indeed a root cause of intolerance and discrimination. Confronted with a resurgence of anti-Semitism, outbreaks of Islamophobia, and growing religious diversity, OSCE nations are scrambling to find ways to help their citizens live with one another. When religious differences are involved, ignorance is far from bliss. Until recently, many politicians and educators on both sides of the Atlantic shrugged off teaching about religions as an inconvenient add-on, or avoided it as a subject too hot to handle. True, in recent years, there has been some progress toward inclusion of religion in the curriculum, especially in the United States and Great Britain. But most schools across OSCE nations continue to ignore study about religions and beliefs. But now changing demographics in a post-9/11 world has put religion front and center in nations worried about exploding religious diversity, alienated youths, skinheads, homegrown terrorists. Learning about what your neighbors believe and practice won't answer all of these challenges overnight, of course. But I would argue that it can go a long way toward creating more social cohesion and, most important, more support for religious freedom.